if an election is not held within 60 days, then the end of Uhuru's occupancy of State House or any other office, all other offices, physical offices, and constitutional powers ends at the end of those 60 days.
A very good evening to you. Welcome to Crossfire. So tonight, that statement by James Orengo is what we'll try to analyze for you. Tonight, we want to make sure that by the time we leave the studio, you understand exactly what the Constitution says and who was saying the truth, who may have misrepresented facts. And in studio, we have Anthony Oluoch, he's an advocate of the High Court and Madara Member of Parliament as well, sir. Thank you so much, Mheshimiwa, for joining us on Crossfire this evening. Right next to him, we have Jennifer Shamala, who's also an advocate of the High Court, and a Jubilee Member of Parliament. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us on Crossfire this evening. All right, Mheshimiwa Oluoch, let me begin with you. And before we get that, I'd like to listen into the different sentiments from different leaders, including lawyers, on what the country is now talking about, whether or not the powers of the presidency, and indeed whether or not there will be a constitutional crisis in the country if the country does not go into an election within the 60 days. Listen in.
The president remains in office with his full executive powers, except that he may, and then I said that out to you.
The country may be bordering on a constitutional crisis of grave proportion. A constitutional crisis in the sense that the powers that the president would normally enjoy were extinguished very substantially on the 8th of August 2017. And after the 8th of August, he was exercising temporary powers of incumbency.
The president remains in office with his full executive powers, except that he may, and then I said that out to you.
Rais wa Jamhuri ya Kenya mpaka mwingine ataapishwa ni Uhuru Kenyatta.
Because when you keep on asserting that a lame duck caretaker president is in full authority, everybody wonders what the word full authority means. Thank you. The Attorney General is evidently being his master's voice. What he's saying clearly shows how he is misreading or not reading at all the provisions of the Constitution. President Uhuru today is a caretaker president.
Haya basi, Rais wa Jamhuri ya Kenya ni Uhuru Kenyatta. And we've heard from different, very learned individuals in this country giving different interpretations. And that is why we have the two lawyers in studio. Both of them carried their copies of the Constitution just to read through and help you to understand where exactly or what exactly is the correct position. So, Mheshimiwa Oluoch, let me begin with you. Rais wa Jamhuri ya Kenya ni Uhuru Kenyatta. How much powers does the president have?
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. First of all, we agreed with my colleague here that we are going to ensure that this looks like a law class. We share two things with her.
Yeah.
One, that we are first-time members of parliament and we both come from the bar. So we agreed that there's going to be some committee and no fire extinguishers will be necessary to
Absolutely.
put this. Let me begin first as I answer your question by saying that this discussion is good. For two reasons. If you look at the Constitution, everybody is entitled to interpret the Constitution. I've had arguments of people saying that, you know, the Attorney General cannot be the authority to interpret. The Supreme Court has the ultimate authority to give advisory opinion. But if you look at Article 10 of the Constitution, it says that state organs, state officers, and other persons, they're bound to follow the values and principles of the Constitution whenever it is they enact in respect of members of parliament, and when they interpret. So meaning the powers of interpretation, though given to the courts, you and I are also entitled to do our own interpretation. The Attorney General has given his interpretation, and now wants to give mine. The learned senior James Orengo is the one who said that I hope the Attorney General wasn't reading the Chinese Constitution. So today I carried my Constitution. Okay. So you've asked me the question whether Uhuru is president, yes, and for how long he is president. I would like to answer that question by saying that the term election or the election of the president is fixed in about 3 circumstances under the Constitution. So for us to be able to understand whether a president can be president outside of those 3 parameters, it is important that I take you through those 3. 1, there has been a fallacy that there is no time limit to the presidency. And so the people who read Article 142, and it's important that we don't read it out of context, and this is what Githu said, and the Constitution says that, you know, the time of the president shall hold office for a term beginning the date on which the president was sworn in, and ending when the next elected president is sworn in accordance with Article 136(2). Okay. So what Githu Muigai and people who are interpreting this part of the Constitution don't seem to be saying is that there is 136(2). So it's important that we go back to 136(2) to understand what it says, isn't it? But as we go there, let us make a stop at 134, okay, the exercise of temporary powers of incumbency. We've seen that he stays in office until the next president is elected. 134 says that a person who holds office of president or who is authorized in terms of the Constitution to exercise those powers, yeah, during the period commencing the date of the first vote in a presidential election and ending when the newly elected president assumes office, those powers are limited. So there is no argument about that. He doesn't have the full powers. Yes. Okay. There is no, he doesn't enjoy the full powers. So let us go to 136(2). 136(2) will unveil what people have been trying to do in terms of misinterpretation. That the president, there is no term. It is fixed. It says at 136, the title is election of president. And it says, an election of a president shall be held on the same day as the general election of members of parliament, being the 2nd Tuesday of August every 5 years. Okay. So up to that point, there are 2 undisputable points. That an election of president is within the 4 corners of 5 years. Outside of 5 years, we must define who that person is if there has been no election. So there are 2 other circumstances then that you talk about an election. Outside of 136 and outside of 138. That is the general election. It is fixed at 5 years. Then we go now to Article 138(10). When the president meets the threshold under 138(3), then the chairman of the commission declares him president and he becomes now president-elect. That is the term. He has moved from being president, so Uhuru cannot say, I am Rais. He is president-elect. But essentially, we had an election that was nullified. So is he still president-elect? I want to take you through the motion so that I will make my conclusion and then you agree or disagree with me. Okay, this is law 101. I'm telling you. So when you leave that safe avenue called the presidency, when you submit yourself to a general election, you cease to be the president and become president-elect if declared, isn't it? Yes. If your election is not challenged within 14 days, you become president when you are declared through assumption of office. That is Article 141. Okay. But if there is a petition within the meaning of Article 140, you're neither now president, you cease to be president-elect because your declaration has been challenged, and you enter now the uncharted waters of what we are calling the temporary powers of incumbency, isn't it? Okay. That now brings me to my last point, that the 2nd election contemplated under the Constitution outside of the general election is the election by reference of 60 days after a determination of a presidential petition.
Okay.
So the million-dollar question then is, election is fixed at under 136(2) to 5 years by reference to the term limit of parliamentarians. Okay. You have gone through that. It has been challenged. Now you've gone through a re-election, which does not take place. When else do you have an election that you can benchmark, yeah, the legitimacy of the person who wants to continue being? I want you to take you to the last circumstance under which we can have an election under this constitution.
I need Shamala to say something.
Yes, I will just summarize it in 2 points. When you leave the general election under 136 and 138, you go to 140, which is the fresh election. Outside of those two, we'll take you to 145 and 146 that talks about the removal of president by impeachment, by vacancy of incapacity or incapacitation. Outside of those three, if there is no election, how does Uhuru Kenyatta continue to tell people he's president? When is the next election? Because the next election under 136 will be the second Tuesday of August after the term of the 12th parliament.
So from where you sit, what position does Uhuru Kenyatta occupy now?
He continues to occupy that territory where he is exercising the temporary powers of incumbency, pending the 60 days when we must have a fresh election. Outside of that, either he has died or is incapacitated or is impeached. That's when we can have another election. After that, tunaenda mpaka the second Tuesday of August of 2022.
Okay. Shamala, this is where you come into this conversation. Yes, he's disputing everything that the General said yesterday.
Yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity to say what I would like to say. First and foremost, my learned colleague and member of Parliament has stated, he's talked about 5 years. If we begin to talk about the issue of 5 years, actually Uhuru Kenyatta has not even served for 5 years. If you remember, the election was in March of 2013. So if we want to go that way, that term will end in April when he was sworn in of 2018. Okay? So that's not what the correct position is. Secondly, he talks about president-elect. If, for argument's sake, it was the NASA candidate that had won this election, and it was the Jubilee candidate that had petitioned the Supreme Court, and the election had been nullified, who would have been the president-elect? Would it have been Uhuru Kenyatta, or would it have been Raila Amolo Odinga? So that is also not a correct fact. The fact is that we had an election on the 8th of August of this year, and it was nullified. Now, the Black's Law Dictionary defines a nullity, and I want to read it so that the viewers and the public understand that I'm not picking words out of my own head. It's an act or a proceeding that has never taken place. Okay. So at that point, I want to differ with the Attorney General of this country, who has said that he has temporary incumbency and hence some of his powers are limited. As we speak now, the president is a president with full rights. He's not a temporary incumbent because the election was nullified. It may be argued by some quarters, they will say it was the declaration that was nullified. Yes, you nullified a declaration of that election. And when you nullified that declaration, you also nullified the vote. Remember, we were told the numbers notwithstanding. Once you nullified it, it is as if that act did not take place. So it is my considered opinion that the president enjoys full powers. I hear Senator Orengo referring to him as a caretaker president. I challenge the Honorable Senator to point out to me anywhere in this Constitution where the word caretaker president is written.
Mheshimiwa is here, he can help us.
Okay, very well. First, as I answer that question, I think we need to read the issue of the term of when did Uhuru's term begin, because she's alluded to it, and she says if the question is 5 years, then we must take Uhuru Kenyatta to 2018. I want us to read the Constitution again so that today we do not misquote or come out with what we think are our ideas of the Constitution.
Yeah.
I want to read 136(2)(a) again. It says, an election of the president shall be held on the same day as the election of members of parliament, which is within 5 years. That's what it says. So you cannot say, select the question 5 years and then remove on the same day. The same day we had members of parliament elected is the same day Uhuru was also voted for. There can be no other same day of members of parliament until 2022. So can we agree on that one, that is beyond
paradigm? No, I don't agree, because
so that we move and get our audience along
Let
the way.
us not mix things up. We're not talking about an election of members of parliament right now. We are addressing the presidential election. We're addressing the comments made by Senator Orengo, where he has said that if Uhuru Kenyatta if we do not have an election within, what did he say, 60 days,
there will be a constitutional crisis.
There will be a constitutional crisis, and that he is a caretaker president.
That's what we're talking about.
Okay?
Yes,
we'll come back. Now, we are talking about the presidential election here. We're not talking about the members of parliament's election. It was the presidential election that was nullified.
And from there you sit.
And his argument was that a president can only, the term of the president is 5 years. My counter response to that is, if it is, you say, the term it cannot be more than 5 years, then Uhuru's term can run right up to April of 2017.
Okay.
That's not what I'm suggesting that Jubilee wants to do, but what I'm saying is you did say that.
I hear you. I hear you.
Yes?
But allow me to make this point again. I said, and I want to repeat, that elections can only take place by reference to when an election is stated in the Constitution. And then I said, elections are stated in 3 circumstances. In 136, the reference of a presidential election, and the title is here, is by reference to the term of parliament, and it says 5 years. Up to that point, I don't think there's an argument. Then there is a second reference, which is the one after the nullification, which is at Article 140. The fourth one is when the president dies or is incapacitated.
Yes, but we're not discussing the issues of parliament, and we're not discussing the death of the president.
The reason you cannot leave it is that there was a reason that under this title, the framers of the Constitution said, because people have been saying Uhuru does not have a term limit. But the framers of the Constitution, somehow, in their own wisdom, they framed election of the president under 136 by reference to an election of members of parliament. Allow me. And they added the word within the term limit of 5 years. So what I want to respectfully submit is that within the meaning of 136, a general election of a president can only take place when members of parliament have an election. Remember, the counter-argument of that, in which people have also suggested, is let us separate the election of the president and the other tiers. But so long as they remain the same day, it is stated here as it shall be on the same day for purposes of a general election.
In the event that a member of parliament, a petition succeeds, and a member of parliament's election is nullified, it is separate of the presidential.
That is a by-election.
Yes, it is a by-election for a member of parliament.
Remember, I was talking about general election.
Yes. But right now we're talking.
I
think we should be honest and we should be straightforward here. We're talking about the fact that, let us be very clear, the presidential election has been nullified. I'm asking a simple question. Where is the word caretaker? Where does it say that he's a caretaker? Where does it say that if the election is not held within 60 days,
the Attorney General,
the
Attorney General said there is no government known to the Constitution of Kenya called transitional or caretaker government other than what is defined in the Constitution.
Can I talk about that?
Please.
When you look at how the president metamorphosed after the vote, you will find that he moves from stages which I had said. President, the vote is done, he becomes president-elect. If there is no challenge, he is sworn in. If it is challenged, then he occupies 134, temporary powers of incumbency. I want to submit here that the reason the Constitution put that provision is that there should be no lacuna during that time while we go to the second election. He becomes a trustee, isn't it? And who is a trustee? A trustee is somebody who is holding things together for a temporary reason, pending handing over.
So from where you sit...
Okay.
Can
But
I agree to be civil?
We are going to be civil, Mheshimiwa, but you're taking more time. Okay, fine. Yes.
Can I finish?
Okay.
So the reason we are saying this is caretaker is because within the context of the powers he's enjoying, and because we don't have a lacuna, he is holding the office and the powers limited ones in trust. That is why we are calling him a caretaker. You don't have to find that term in the Constitution.
Okay. So,
can I, please, I must comment on that.
You should.
I must.
You
I
should.
must set the record straight.
You should.
When he refers to Article 134, he's talking about the exercise of presidential powers during temporary incumbency. Now, when and why is the term temporary incumbency? I said earlier on, if it had been Raila Odinga who had won the election, let me find that. Please, we said we're being civil.
Just
now I have
yes,
I know, but let me finish. Because you don't know whether I'm going to read it or not. Well. Yes. Now, if Raila Odinga had become the president, had been elected president in August of this year, and then that would have made, and there was no challenge to his election, it would have made Uhuru Kenyatta he is now a temporary incumbent. Now, the reason for these limitations to what a temporary incumbent were put in was so that certain appointments are not made he doesn't take advantage of that temporary incumbency to do the things that are spelt out here. For example, dismiss cabinet secretaries, appoint ambassadors, etc., etc. Yeah. So let us be very clear on why the phrase temporary incumbency. It is to protect the incoming president in the event that incoming president is not the sitting president. Nowhere does it talk about caretaker. That was the rationale and the reasoning behind this particular article of the Constitution. Having said that, I want to go back to the defense of this Constitution. And it says that every person has an obligation to respect, uphold, and defend this Constitution. And any attempt to establish a government outside of or not in compliance with this Constitution is unlawful. So when you describe Uhuru Kenyatta as a caretaker president, he could have been a sitting president, he could have been a temporary incumbent, because they could have been a president-elect that is not him, but nowhere is there the word caretaker.
Let me run something by you. James Orengo, the council said the powers that the president would normally enjoy were extinguished substantially on the 8th, and that he is now exercising temporary powers of incumbency. You disagree with that?
I disagree. And tell me something. Why did this argument not come up on the 8th? Why is this argument coming up now? Why is this narrative coming up now? I'll tell you why.
Why?
We have heard since yesterday, for the last 2 weeks or the last week, NASA saying there will be no election. No reforms, no elections. And they've been asked severally. In fact, the head of NASA was being interviewed from Bondo last night on NTV. And his comments were that every citizen of Kenya has a right to prevent the commission of a crime on election day. He's presupposing that on election day there will be criminal activity. Now, the reason the narrative of caretaker government is now being shaped is because, indeed, they intend not to have an election. And if you don't have an election, what happens, because the Constitution is very clear, that the general... Sorry?
But in the same breath, I remember NASA flag bearer Raila Odinga, in the same breath also said, if the conditions that we are setting are actually addressed, we have no problem.
Yeah, I'll go back to the conditions, but I'm trying to tell you why the term caretaker. NASA has a brilliant habit of creating myths. And once it settles in the minds of people, and that is why they're creating the myth of caretaker, they then go on to other issues. Now, when they keep on saying there will be no election, the general principles of an electoral system say that it must be free from violence, intimidation, etc. Remember, we have a Supreme Court ruling based on qualitative aspects, not quantitative. The vote, the numbers no longer matter. It's the process. He's saying free of intimidation. On the other hand, we are told that every citizen has a right to prevent a commission of a crime. We're being told that the citizens of Kenya, if we go forth to have this election, will take matters in their own hand to prevent the commission of a crime. Let me fast forward. It then says the Constitution is very clear that an election to be valid must be held in every constituency. So if there is no election in even one constituency, it will be nullified. And it is for these reasons, and if it is nullified yet again, we shall go back to the same process where Uhuru Kenyatta will remain the president, will not be a temporary incumbent. And hence the reason and the talk about a caretaker president.
Mheshimiwa.
Okay, very well. First, let me
First of all, NASA does not want an election.
Under Article 3. She makes the point, which I don't dispute, that any attempt to form a government other than the one contemplated under this Constitution, is illegal. But I also want to draw our attention to the provisions of Article 146.3. 146.3 of the Constitution contemplates that a person who assumes office of president following an election required under Clause 2 shall, unless otherwise removed, and that's where I want to dwell at. The word otherwise removed must import inferences that a sitting president may lose that status of being sitting president under circumstances that we are now suggesting would be a fluxion of time. And this is how I tried to argue it, that after the expiry of 60 days, if we do not have an election which is not a general election, and one conducted at the expiry of 60 days following the judgment, then the time has passed. By a fluxion of time, he has otherwise ceased to be president. So this would not be extra-constitutional, like they're trying to put it. It would not be extra-constitutional. Now, let me come to the point about what they think is the NASA game plan.
Yeah, NASA doesn't want an election.
Remember, this is what they thought when they came to the Supreme Court to argue a case we never filed. And that is how they have totally misread everything that NASA is doing. So now they are misreading into this statement that there will be no election, according to what they think.
NASA does not want.
Let me finish. I kept quiet and I was very attentive when you spoke.
Okay, come.
So let us go to the Supreme Court judgment. The Supreme Court judgment, and read together with the Constitution, did not contemplate an election. It did not contemplate any election. It said, carry out an election with strict or in strict compliance with the law. So that is why NASA has put together what they called their irreducible minimum. What they think would be that strict compliance. Instead of telling us that on your point 1 of this so-called strict compliance, this is our response. They are 12. They are yet to come and tell us this is unreasonable and unlawful. This cannot be done because ABCD. We cannot, we will go by Al Ghurair because of this. Instead of addressing those issues, which is why we are saying there will be no election, they are saying NASA wants to get a caretaker government. What we mean is the Supreme Court made a finding, carry out an election in strict compliance with the law. Among those conditions was a letter we wrote to the DPP, complete with 17 charges against members of the commission and members of the Secretariat. And on Monday, tomorrow, we have instructions to include non-members of the commission, and in this respect, a senior member of Jubilee, Mr. Chirchir, who himself has made multiple entries into the server. These persons must be prosecuted. Rather than address these issues, they are now going diversionary about NASA does not want an election. There will be an election, but an election that strictly complies with the law. If it does not, there will be no election because it cannot be done otherwise.
So does NASA want an election? We
want an election, address the 12 points and the demands, and there will be an election. If they don't, the Constitution contemplates there will be no election.
If I may. So
I have
no,
30 seconds.
It's not fair. I have a right of reply.
Trust
he has
me,
discussed strict compliance of the law. On what basis was this? And then we can come back and I will get an opportunity. Okay, fine. Thank you.
All right.
All right. Sorry, I thought the show was ending. Okay.